Hey everybody, welcome to our virtual Bible study. If you are tuning in for our series, we are on lesson number 9 tonight. So we appreciate very much you tuning in. Hey, before we get into the actual video, I would like to encourage you to do two things. We ask you to do it every week. If you are on YouTube, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Now there's going to be probably a red box below the video somewhere, sort of a rectangular box that's going to say the word subscribe, and just hit that button and subscribe to our channel. That means that you never get to miss content, and we get the added benefit of when you watch the content, it bumps us up in the queue and makes us a little bit more visible on YouTube. So we would appreciate you doing that. Also give us a thumbs up. You can do that on YouTube as well. And we don't mention it often, but there is an option on YouTube to share the video from YouTube in a number of ways, including emails. So if you want to email a link to YouTube to somebody you think would benefit from the video, send it. And when they click on that, it takes them straight to the YouTube video and they can watch it from there. Also, we encourage you, if you are on Facebook, please give us a thumbs up and please share the video on your timeline. That's very important. It helps us to get the video out. It's more visible, and that's what we want. We want the video to be visible. We want it to be seen. We understand that not everybody, perhaps in our culture today, is going to agree with the things that we're saying. That's okay. Not in the sense that we think it's okay that they disagree. We want people to agree, but sometimes people have to wrestle with facts before they can come to a knowledge of the truth. But they've got to have the facts to do that. Okay, so there might be disagreement, and you might share it with somebody that you know is going to disagree. That's a good thing to do. Go ahead and share it, and let's have the conversation. Let's talk about the tough things, and let's try to get truth to people. If you have any questions at all, I don't list it on YouTube, and I won't put it on Facebook, but my contact information is easy enough to find. So please get in touch with me if you have questions. I'm not averse to talking by phone, and I've made the offer before. I hope that at some point with some we can sit down and have a cup of coffee somewhere and just talk. I'd love to do that. I'm not a terrible person. I'm not a mean guy. I don't think I'm a mean guy. I'll sit down and talk with you, and I'll be just as kind as I'm being right now. We might not agree, but let's have a conversation about our disagreement. I think that makes the world a better place when we can talk about the things that we disagree with and be kind in our conversation. So do that. Hit me up for that if you want to do that. So tonight, lesson number 9. We're in lesson 9 tonight. And tonight we are entering our discussion of perhaps, maybe, the biggest of the subjects that we will discuss regarding God. It's the issue of evil and suffering and where God fits in all of that. That's a big one, right? And we're going to divide that up in 2 parts. We're going to have some good conversation for the next 2 lessons on that. It's really going to be one long extended lesson for 2 weeks worth of videos. So I hope you'll stay tuned, and I hope you can't interact because we do that in the class on Wednesday evenings when we come together. We have live interaction, and we have some discussion questions, and people get to go and they get to study that in advance and then come back and talk about the things they've studied, which makes class great. We can't do that here, so it's just me discussing the way I'm approaching the subject. But I hope that you're thinking it through as well. I hope you'll take some time and think of it. Think through it on your own, and follow truth. Follow where truth leads. This is a big subject, though. Of all the arguments that are used in opposition to God, of all the ones that have been used to say this is the reason why you should not believe in God, I think the most frequently employed, I think I'm on good ground to say that. I think the one that is most often used to try to pull people away from belief in God, and with some success, I might add. Not that it makes the argument true, I just say with some success. It's a very emotional, very impactful argument. Is an appeal to the existence of evil and suffering in this world. Now, I'll get into the argument specifically and some shades of that, some variations of that in just a moment, but the argument is something of such that it goes like this. If God is so good and he allows evil in this world, then there really isn't a God. He's not good at all. He's not the God that you describe. There is no God. Now we'll talk about that. We're gonna dissect that argument and see whether that holds truth or not. We're going to talk extensively about evil and suffering in this world, why it exists, and how we deal with it, how we explain it. But you might see already why somebody who's, especially if they're bitter, right? They've gone through something that's just terrible suffering, why they might be appealed to that by that argument and say, yeah, I mean, why would God, if he was real, why didn't he stop that from happening? That you can see how that might be a powerful argument. It's been a very effective argument. Not effective in the sense that it's true, but the emotive part of it has definitely clicked with some people. Right? It's pulled people away from belief in God. I think the issue of evil and suffering has been for a lot of atheists. I can't say all of them, all right, because I'm not in the mind of all of them, but I've read enough atheists. I've got a whole what's on the other side. But I have a whole section of books written by atheists, right? So I'm fair in my reading. I don't just read Christianity. I read atheists as well. And I think that many of them believe it's the single most damning evidence against God. And because of that, there are some of them who they may not use the language, but I think they feel that this is an unanswerable dilemma for theists. There's no way that we can honestly and truthfully answer this question. So I think that explains a lot, especially in the rhetoric they use against theism, because they purport that theism, many of them do, again, I can't say it for every single atheist. If you're an exception to the rule, that's fine. When I make a statement, I'm saying generically, it seems to be that they suggest that theism is merely a coping mechanism, right? That we've invented God as a coping mechanism against evil and suffering in the world. And if belief in God is necessary to bear through evil and pain, then God to them is just imagined. It's not actual. That is in the mind of an atheist, right? And I don't say, again, all of them, but I know that many of them believe that based on things I've read. And I want to read a quote from one such leader, one thinker among them, and he says this: simply postulate a nasty God such as the one who stalks every page of the Old Testament. Or, if you don't like that, invent a separate evil God, call him Satan, and then blame his cosmic battle against the good God for the evil in the world. Or, a more sophisticated solution, postulate a God with grander things to do than fuss about human suffering. Or a God who is not indifferent to suffering, but regards it as the price that one has to be paid for free will in an orderly, lawful cosmos. Theologians can be found buying into all of these rationalizations. Now, the first thing you notice is that this particular man calls it a rationalization. Right? To him, it's the way that people justify what's happening in the world. And even if he hints at what the answer might be in this issue, even if he hints at that, he sets it up that even if you believe what he hints could be the truth, then you're obviously just feigned for doing it, right? You're just sort of a kook for believing in that to be the answer to the issue. And so he sets it up that even if some of that is the actual explanation to the issue about free will and how that works, then it's foolish to even subscribe to that. So he sort of he sets people up to disbelieve in what actually could be the answer that he's admitted at the end of that. So we're going to talk about that later. But I think that's pretty typical. I think that the majority of atheists, again, don't take issue because I said all, because I know that there may be exceptions to it, but I think the majority believe that theism, that that we only believe in God as a way of sort of rationalizing, justifying the existence of evil and suffering in the world. There are many other examples of that. I could go on and on just reading quotes from that, but I think that's an illustration, and that mindset illustrates the preference that people show to the problem of evil and suffering, why it's such a big deal, why that's the go-to argument for them. Now, I can see that from an emotional standpoint. Now, there are essentially there's two kinds of suffering in this world. And I want to introduce these because I want us to be able to explore these as we go through. The first of these is what we would call natural evil, right? This is physical evil that's in the world. And we face it every day. Everybody is surrounded by it in news cycles. We hear about it in adverse weather patterns. We read about it. Perhaps we know people who've experienced things like this. You may remember some years ago, right? It's been a while now, but it's still fresh because within our generation, maybe people can remember it, but there was a huge tsunami that went through Malaysia, Thailand, just a huge, enormous tsunami that went through in the early 2000s. You may remember that. And there was another tsunami in 2004, or there was one in 2004, and I think there was one very shortly after that somewhere else. But tens of thousands of people died. Horrible, horrible thing that happened. That's a natural evil, right? It's not as though somebody created that. It's not as though somebody caused that. Nobody was out with a big enough boat rocking the boat, causing such a tidal wave. There are such things as natural disasters. There's physical suffering in the world as a result of that. Hurricane Katrina. Maybe some of you aren't old enough to remember Hurricane Katrina, but it hasn't been all that long that Hurricane Katrina went through. There were parts of Florida and Texas, but especially New Orleans, very affected by that. Hurricane Sandy did the same thing on the East Coast. So force of nature can cause physical suffering. Natural disasters, physical calamities cause injury, and they might even cause or spark disease and sickness. And there's just the whole other issue of sickness and disease in this world. And physical evil, right? Natural evil affects all people. Regardless, it affects atheists, it affects theists. No one is exempted from that in this world. It's a horrible thing that exists, but it does exist. And then on the other side of that, you have spiritual or moral evil, right? So these are based on the choices that people make and the suffering that comes from the choices that people make. Not all choices lead to suffering, but some do. And these are identified by the choices that injure self or injure other people. It's based on misconduct. For example, it's a horrible thing. God forbid that it would ever happen again. But it does. We hear about it. We read about it. We may even know people who've experienced it. But sometimes individuals get raped or people rape other individuals. Horrible, horrible thing. It injures people physically, sexually, emotionally, psychologically. People are affected by that for the rest of their lives. Theft or murder or deceit. All of those are choices that people make, but there are consequences to those choices, and it brings moral evil, or the consequences of moral evil, into the world, just like there are physical consequences to natural evil. So you have these two forms that exist in the world, and there may be, some variation under each of those, but in a nutshell, right, just basically those two forms of evil. Both of those evils result in grief and heartache and sorrow. That's suffering. That's what it is. Now, there are different levels of suffering, right? Because not everybody suffers at the same level or to the same degree. And maybe some of that is based on your relationship to the consequences of either natural or moral evil that's in the world. There was a fellow by the name of Milton Ferguson who wrote a book called The Problem of Evil and Suffering. And I thought he had a great sort of a breakdown of what he called the three tiers of suffering, or the three levels of suffering. And I just think it's a great way of helping us to understand that there are sort of degrees of suffering, tiers of suffering that exist based on moral and natural evil. So the first of those would be biological. There's biological suffering. We'll call that physiological suffering. This is the biological experience of pain. It's the physiological reaction to stimuli. Death could be one of those, but there could be disease, right? Or there's an accident and you get cut, you get maimed in some way, and you suffer biologically as a result of some type of evil. And it could be natural or moral evil that's in the world. You can biologically suffer as a result of that. Then you can socially suffer. This is the psychological part of suffering. Suffering that comes of man trying to get along with fellow man, and something impedes that. And there's suffering as a result of that, a consequence of that. There's hurt and pain from words and conflict and actions. So people suffer that way. And then there's moral or religious suffering. And this, if you're going to divide it, it might be what we would call philosophical suffering. But this is the struggle that people have with maybe questions of suffering, or something along those lines, division between that person and God. And there are different levels, tiers of suffering. People suffer in different ways based on, you can have a natural calamity and people still struggle religiously with that because they don't quite understand why suffering would take place, and they struggle with that. There's suffering involved in that. The mind and the body are paired together. They go together. They're impacted. They might be impacted in different ways, right, at different levels, and to different degrees, but they're suffering for the mind and the body. So the question gets raised as a result of that. And I'm introducing this because, not that I believe it, but I want you to understand the effect that this has had on people. And maybe you're a person who's been affected by this argument. The argument goes like this: if God is good, if he's all-powerful, if he is all-wise, if he's all of those things, why does he allow evil in this world? Why does evil exist? Why does suffering exist? Why would a God in heaven allow rape? Why would he do that? Why would he allow murder to take place? Why would he allow war ever to take place? And many have been caught off guard by that. So if you're not in a position to answer that, you may be caught off guard because it sounds reasonable, especially when that argument employs the very attributes of God, right? So you can see maybe how that might be effective to take what is actually true of God and try to use that against him. So the argument would be, for example, with his power, they would say if God is all-powerful and he cannot stop suffering in this world, then he's not all-powerful. That might be something that spurs doubt in a person. Or if God is all-loving, right, if he's an omnibenevolent God, if he's caring and he will not stop suffering, then he's not all-caring and therefore he's not God. And so I think it's easy to understand why that argument has been used with such an effect as it has been used. Because when people cannot understand suffering, or they're embittered by suffering themselves, they've experienced it, maybe they've experienced the death of a loved one, or they have prolonged disease, something, and they can't understand why God doesn't remove that, then it's easy to take God out of the picture as the easy route of explaining suffering in this world. You just take God out of the picture to do that. And you think about it, there's a lot of suffering in this world. If you go to FBI.gov, they usually keep up-to-date statistics on crime in the world. And just a few years ago, they were saying there's a violent crime every 20-something seconds. It was like on the average every 25 seconds. A murder every 30-something seconds in America. A forcible rape every 6 to 7 seconds, something like that. One robbery every second, 1.5 seconds, something. An aggravated assault every 40-ish seconds in America. How can that be? Why would God allow that? If he's real, why would he allow that to take place? So it's a big argument for atheism. All right, so real quick, I want to answer that. I want to give a couple things in answer to this question, that if God is all good, he won't stop suffering, then he's not really as good as you say that he is. And if he's all powerful and he can't do it, then he's really not all powerful, and therefore he's not God, not as you have described him. And of course, I think in the back of that, we'll see this as we go through. One of the things is it doesn't really disprove God. What it does, it just embitters people against God. It tries to turn people against God. So I don't know that it really converts people to atheism as much as it just turns people into agnostics, maybe. I don't know. But here's some answers. Number one, just real quick, and I wish I could spend a whole lot of time on these, but we can't for sake of time. I'm dividing this up. We're definitely going to do 2 weeks on this. So 2 weeks, and we're done on this. We're going to move on to just a few more subjects in our study. So here's number one. This line of argumentation presupposes that God is only defined by goodness and greatness. It limits the nature of God to those two things. Now, I want to be very upfront. God is benevolent. He is good. He's infinitely good. God is all benevolent. He's omnibenevolent. For example, and I know that if you're an atheist or you're an agnostic or you're a skeptic and you're watching this, these Bible verses don't mean a single thing to you. But if you're a theist, I just want to make note of these. Matthew 19, verse 17, the Bible mentions that God is good. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, or even in John 3:16, the Bible tells us that he loves the world and he cares for us. In James chapter 1, verse 17, God gives perfectly, and what he gives is good. The way he gives it and what he gives is perfect for us. In Matthew 5, verse 45, he makes the sun to rise on the just and on the unjust. So if you're an atheist, he makes the sun rise for you too, just as much as he does for me. Genesis 1, verse 31, everything is very good. That's what God is capable of. It's what he is. In Habakkuk 1 and verse 13, he's a pure eyes than behold evil. Pure eyes than to behold evil. He is morally perfect. So God is good. God is also all powerful. There's no denying that. Again, if you're an atheist, you're not going to mind any of these, but if you're a theist, here's some verses for you. In Jeremiah 32, verse 27, nothing is too hard for God. In Psalm 147 and verse 5, his power is infinite. His understanding is infinite. His power is great. In Matthew 19, verse 26, all things are possible with God. In Revelation 19, verse 6, God is omnipotent. He is almighty. So the problem in that line of argumentation is not what we believe in regard to the nature of God as attributes. The problem is the use of those attributes by atheists who would use it that way to deny the existence of God. And I would say that goes back to the empty room scenario that we presented way back when, that you can't fathom what doesn't exist. None of us can do that. You can't tell me about what does not exist in a room. We have no capacity for doing that. That's not how the human mind is built. We just have no capability for that. I don't think those atheists that argue this way can argue against the existence of God by granting defining characteristics to God and then saying, and by the way, he's none of those things. You can't do that. That's that empty room argument. So he is so much more than just simply good and powerful. He's a lot more than that. But he can't be just limited to those things and just simply pointing to those two things and saying, it seems to be contradictory to that for God to do that. When he is so much more, that argument doesn't work. So here's number two. The argument itself presupposes the existence of God. And I think this is interesting because the argument actually says that God is pre-existent. To argue against evil, to admit the reality of objective evil, is to admit a standard for defining evil, how evil is defined. And, how is it except objectively? If you're saying, if God allows rape, so you're saying rape is wrong, right? And I'm saying it's wrong. It's universally condemned, except by those who do it, who are morally corrupt people. But people with some common sense can look at rape and say, that is objectively wrong. Well, how do we define what is objectively wrong, if not by God? There's no way to do that. It can't be just simply that you believe it's wrong, and so therefore I should believe it's wrong too. There has to be some standard by which we all can say murder's wrong, rape is wrong, you shouldn't steal, that's wrong. Wrong is wrong because of God. How can anybody say that anything is evil without also admitting the reality of God? So argument two, or number two, is the argument actually implies the existence of God because you're admitting the existence of objective evil in the world. You're saying evil does exist. It's reality. Number three, the argument presupposes that God is required to eliminate evil and suffering. That's what the argument is. He must do something with it, or else he's not God. Merely citing the omnibenevolence of God does not explain why that attribute requires him to remove evil and suffering from the world. God is omnibenevolent, and if he doesn't remove it, he's not omnibenevolent. Well, no. That you can't say 2 + 2 = 9. You can't do that, right? You can't make such a leap as that. Why is God required to do something to eliminate suffering in order to be God? Why is that? Explain that. If he doesn't eliminate suffering, he ceases to exist as God. Why is that? Who sets that standard for God? That argument misunderstands what makes God God. God doesn't exist because of the absence of evil. That's not why he exists. God is good, and he's not responsible for the evil in the world, because if he's omnibenevolent, he's good, and he's not responsible for what exists in the world. Here's number four. The argument presupposes that God is not doing something about evil. See, there's an implication when they say, God's not doing anything. How do you know he's not doing anything? How do you know that? Maybe he is doing something about evil and suffering in the world. By arguing that God either cannot or does not want to alleviate suffering, atheists are actually, the ones that make the argument, are actually suggesting that there's no present relief from that. And that's just not true. That's not true. It's not a true argument. Simply citing the existence of evil does nothing to undo the existence of God or the fact that God is working to relieve the suffering of man. And again, I know if you're an atheist, you're not going to like the verses, but there are verses for that. For example, in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus said, "Come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden. I'll give you rest." There is relief for suffering in the world. God's very well aware of suffering in the world, but he's doing something about it. You may not like the way he's doing it, but you can't say he's not doing something when he actually is doing something about it. Number five, that argument implies that everyone experiences the sum of all pain and suffering, which is not true. Every person experiences his or her own pain. It may not be the same as another person's. If it's 80 degrees in Nashville, Tennessee, and 85 degrees in Memphis, and 80 degrees in Chattanooga, no Tennessean is experiencing the same 245 degrees of heat between them all. You know, our temperature's not going to be that. Everybody has their own experience in suffering, and so not everybody's on the same level. Remember, we talked about those levels. And then here's number six. Here's the number six of this. The argument presupposes that there's no value in suffering, right? It's almost implying, what a horrible thing. This is just the worst, and get rid of it. Well, suffering is bad, but are there benefits in suffering? We're gonna talk about benefits next week in our next lesson, but it's just untrue that there's no benefits in suffering. There are benefits to suffering. How can we develop courage unless there's danger? How are we supposed to develop patience and endurance unless we have obstacles in life? Without pain, we can't develop compassion. As we'll see in the next part of this lesson, there's value to suffering. Benefits do come from it. So the argument itself just doesn't work. I know that people think it makes a lot of sense, but to suggest that there's no God because there's suffering in the world, one admits that there's a God because of the objectivity of evil, and it doesn't explain why God can't exist because of evil, and it somehow suggests he's not doing something about it, which he is doing, and that there's no benefits to suffering, which there are. So I hope you'll come in next week and we'll talk about it. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate you always tuning in, and you help to make this this video series great. I mean that with every fiber of my being. We publish it because there's some within our congregation who are homebound. They just can't get out, so we don't want them to miss out. But we're so pleased that so many in the world can see it as well. and we hope that you appreciate it. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up and share the video in what ways you can. And please subscribe to the channel if you're on YouTube. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. Please come back next week, same time. Until then, please know I love you, and God loves you even more than I do. See you then.